All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Menachim Av, the Tilson and Wall families of Eretz Yisrael, sending their love from Eretz Yisrael and inviting all of us in Meretz Hashem to come and join them. Mihera B'Yameinu. Host our week of learning sponsors, Ingrid Fishman and Lynn Caesar, in memory of their mother Charlotte Gevantman Zichron Lebracha and their sister Judith Gevantman on their respective yard sites. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, and the families Ein Nechama. Our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Rod and Candace King, dedicating to all of the Daf Yomi members who, Baruch Hashem, make the opportunity to come and learn in the Beis Medrash online each and every day. Nathan and Beth Adler, in memory of Aunt Betty Gutterman, Zichron Lebracha, on her 15th yard site. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah and the families Ein Nechama. So with that, let us begin. Of course, we dedicate our learning in the schools of our precious hostages. May HaKadosh Baruch Hu bring them back to their mishpachos b'shalom and b'karov, and may our soldiers be successful b'chol ma'aseh yadehem, on all of the fronts, all of the wars that they are fighting on behalf of Eretz Yisrael and all of Am Yisrael. We'll say with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Actually, not so much to do today, but like a lot, not a lot of Gemara, but a lot of interesting concepts. So today's daf is Mem Dalid 44, and we are picking up on Mem Gimel Amud Beis 43b. I realized I really stopped yesterday, like one line too early. So just to reorient ourselves a little bit, the Gemara introduced us to what I think is a very interesting case that we started at the beginning of the Tan Rabbanan. Yes, here was the case, or I should say further a little bit into the Tan Rabbanan. Here was the case. The case was as follows, according to Rav Sheshes. Ruvain stole a field from Shimon and went ahead and sold it to Levi. Okay, so Levi now is the current person holding on to the field, and Yehuda comes to Beis Din claiming that the field belongs to him. So Rav Sheish, the Gemara, explained that halacha l'maisa Shimon is not permitted to go ahead. Shimon is not permitted to go ahead and testify on behalf of Levi. Now remember again, so Shimon is the original, one more time. Ruvain stole a field from Shimon, sold it to Levi. Okay, now Yehuda comes along and claims that the field really belongs to him. So the Gemara spoke about the idea that Shimon, who's the original owner, is not permitted to Beis Din to testify on behalf of Levi. Why? Because he's an ogeh b'davar, right? There's benefit for him. Ultimately, again, he has a conflict of interest. We can't rely on his eidos. That was the idea. So the Gemara was discussing. So we're trying to figure out why exactly is it? In other words, what exactly is he testifying on behalf of Levi? So the Gemara worked through all of that. So the Gemara said as follows: V'ba yisema, 3 lines are from the bottom. V'ba yisema. Now, what the Gemara was asking was, at the end of the day, I don't understand. What's Shimon's ultimate goal, right? What's Shimon's goal? If you're Shimon, what's your goal? Get your property back, right? So if you're going to get your property back, what does it matter who's holding on to it right now? What does it matter if it's Levi who's holding on to it or it's Yehuda who's holding on to it? The Pashtos, you obviously have to furnish some kind of proof that the property belongs to you. Once you furnish that, then you can get it back. So what does it matter if Levi has it or Yehuda has it? So the first approach was, it could very well be that just Levi is an easier guy to deal with than Yehuda. That's the simpler idea. The Gemara says the other possibility is Kigon the Islay Sahadi Lamar, the Islay Sahadi Lamar, the Amrabanan Arahecha de Kaimotikum. The other possibility is that each side has witnesses, and in the case of a real estate dispute where each side has witnesses, Chazal said, leave the land where it is, which is not really such a chiddush. In other words, any time that you have contradictory testimony, essentially what the halacha says is status quo. Status quo. Okay, fine. Top of Mem Daled. The Gemara says, V'lukmei begazlan. So we'll say, the Gemara asks an interesting question. Why do you have to introduce over here? Why do you have to introduce over here the additional layer? In other words, just go ahead. Take a look at the Rashbam. The Rashbam is in the short lines, in those intermediary short lines, about 10 lines. In other words, we'll say, why do you have to go ahead and bring up a case of where Reuven stole it from Shimon and then went ahead and sold it to Levi, and now Levi's ownership is being contested by Yehuda? Why don't you just cut out Levi and just make it a case like this? Reuven stole the field from Shimon. right? So now Reuven has it. Yehuda comes and claims it from Reuven. From Reuven. In other words, cut out the purchaser, cut out Levi, the purchaser, and just make this a case of Reuven stole from Shimon. Reuven has the land because he stole it. Yehuda comes and is claiming it from Reuven. So why not teach us the halacha that Shimon can't go ahead and testify on behalf of Reuven and just leave out the purchaser? Just cut out a layer. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Mishum de kabayla misni seifa, because we need the end of the brisa. What's the end of the brisa? Machar lo para, machar lo talis. Remember again, this was a two-pronged case. The two-pronged case over here was machar lo bayis, machar lo sada, ein meyit alav, mibei shachri yusu alav. Right. So part one of the case was that if I sell Reuven, all right, we'll switch the names on a little bit, right? I sell Reuven a house, I sell Reuven a sada. I can't go ahead and testify in his behalf. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, I have achrayis. Now we'll discuss why exactly that is. Conversely, machar lo para, machar lo talis, if I sold Reuven a cow or a talis, I have the ability to testify in his behalf. Why? Because I don't have achrayis. Now we'll say, now what exactly those cases mean is exactly what we're trying to figure out over here. But again, we'll delve into a little bit more. But now the point the Gemara is making over here is, we need the seifa. That second case has to be a case of a sale. That's where this case comes up, right? That's what we're talking about over here, where I sold a cow or I sold a talis. And since I don't have, I as the seller, don't have achrayis over that sale, therefore I am permitted to testify on behalf of the purchaser that he is the true owner. So since the seifa is a case of a sale, so therefore again the Gemara, in order to create not continuity, in order to create symmetry, right? In order to create literary symmetry between the two parts of the Reisha and the Seifa, also set up the Reisha as the case of a sale. So let me just read that inside. So the Gemara says, so again, remember, so the Gemara's question is, why do you have to make this such a convoluted case of, it's often a question that we ask, right? So why do you have to make this a convoluted case of Reuven steals from Shimon, right, and then sells to Levi, and then Yehuda comes along and contests Levi's ownership. So now the Gemara says, Shimon, the original owner, can't testify on behalf of Levi. So just make it simpler. Reuven steals from Shimon, Yehuda comes and claims it from Shimon, right? That's it. That's the case. That's the case. Leave out the sale piece to Levi. To which the Gemara says, you're right. In order to express our point, I actually don't need Levi involved in our case. So why put in a sale over here? To create brisa symmetry. Since the second part does require a sale, as we will get into, machar lo para, machar lo talis. This is a case of where I'm selling metaltalin, I'm selling movable property to Reuven. So again, in that case, I can testify on behalf of Reuven because I don't have achrayis. Like I said, we'll explain that. That case only works if it's a sale. So because the seifa has to be a sale, therefore the reisha has to be a sale as well, just to create symmetry. Okay, so the Gemara says, the seifa machalo para machalo talis the dafka mecher dahaviyeyosh v'shinoi rishus. So I'll say this is great. So in other words, in a case, in the second case of metaltalin, so ultimately again we have to set it up as a case of mecher. Why? Because in a case of mecher, ultimately again, we'll set up that case as a situation where there is yeyosh and there is shinoi rishus, right? When the object is taken, when the object is stolen, ultimately again there is yeyosh on behalf of the owner, and there's also shinoi rishus. Back to our Bava Kama days, right? So ultimately again, so there's right. So the owner despairs of retrieving it, and there is a change of domain. Aval lo machar, but ultimately again, if there's not a mechira in the second case, where ultimately again the hadrale, that means the owner has the ability to potentially get back the original item, lo, it would not work, meaning in other words, that halacha l'maisa, the original owner, would not be permitted to go ahead and testify. Okay, we're going to get more into that second case in just a little bit. So therefore, again, since the seifa has to be a case of mechira, so therefore, again, in order to maintain symmetry, we make the reisha a case of mechira as well. Tananami mecher, I v'seifa nami nihid miyayish migufe midarme miyayish. So both say again. Now we're assuming over here that halacha l'maisa, we're setting up both cases in the same way, right? So in other words, let's just play this out for just a second. So we're assuming over here that the same brisa that tells us that the Reisha case is Reuven stole from Shimon, sold to Levi, and now Yehuda is contesting Levi's ownership. So what does the Gemara say? So ultimately, again, the Gemara is telling me, the brisa is teaching me that Shimon, the owner, can't testify on behalf of Levi, right? So let's just take a second and go through these cases again. One more time. Reuven steals from Shimon, right? Reuven, part one, right? Part two, Reuven sells to Levi. Okay. Part three, Yehuda shows up and says, Levi, that's not yours, that's mine. So now, Shimon the owner has been tracking these events, right? And what is Shimon the owner? What is he ready to do? He wants to testify on behalf of Levi, right? Which sounds strange, right? So remember again, how is he going to testify on behalf of Levi? What did we say? How is he going to testify on behalf of Levi? He's going to testify, it doesn't belong to Yehuda. That's what he's going to testify. I know for sure it doesn't belong to Yehuda. Why in the world is Shimon testifying on behalf of Levi? What's the answer? Why is he testifying on behalf of Levi? Why? Because he feels, again, Shimon's a smart guy. He feels it's going to be easier to get back his land from Levi than it is with Yehuda. He's going to litigate with Levi, right? It's easier to deal with Levi than it is with Yehuda. So the Gemara now says, by the way, that Shimon is not allowed to testify on behalf of Levi. That's the whole chap. Why? Again, it's very simple. He has a vested interest in this. Right? He has a vested interest in this eidos, and therefore, again, it's a conflict of interest. Therefore, again, we cannot go ahead and leave him to testify. Furthermore, again, if that property is encumbered by let's say some of Shimon's creditors, Shimon has a vested interest in getting that land back. Conversely, in the metaltalin case, what's happening over in the metaltalin case, the same type of metaltalin case, right? Shimon stole a cow from Reuven, sold it to Levi, and now Yehuda is coming along and contesting that it's his cow. The Gemara suggests that Shimon can testify on behalf of Levi. The logic behind that, the Gemara seems to say, is because in that case, there's Yeyosh and Shinoi Rishus. Since it's metaltalin, since it's movable property, so Shimon despairs of retrieving it, and there's also a change of domain. You put those two things together, and ultimately, again, Shimon doesn't really have plans of getting back his cow, and therefore, technically speaking, he's not Nogia Be'edus. He doesn't have a conflict of interest, and he's allowed to testify. The Gemara says, fine, I don't understand that. The Gemara says, Nihi demiyayish migufei. So it could very well be that at the end of the day, Shimon is not going to go ahead and get back his actual cow. But midame mimiyayish, does he go ahead and despair of getting back the value? In other words, why wouldn't he get back the value? So which the Gemara says, lo tzricha demis gazlan. Very interesting. I'll say, what's the case? The case is where Reuven, the thief, died. So same case, right? Reuven stole a cow, but now we're switching to metaltalin. Reuven stole a cow from Shimon, right? Went ahead and sold it to Levi, and now Yehuda is contesting ownership. So the Gemara is saying that the reason in this case why Shimon, the original owner, is allowed to testify on behalf of Levi, the current purchaser, is because there's Yeyosh and Shinoi Rishus, and he has no intention of ever getting it back. So the Gemara says, one second, maybe he's not going to get the cow back, but he should be able to get the value of the cow back. Why would he be miyayish from that? Plot twist, that what? Shimon the thief died. Now listen, what happens if Shimon the thief dies? There's really a lot of interesting information over here. Disnan, Hagozel Umachilas Banav. So also we've actually seen this case before. This is a Bava Kama case. We saw this. Listen, is right. Let's say Reuven steals, and he goes ahead and he gives it to his children. And ultimately, again, he dies and leaves it as Yerusha. Peturim milashalim. Ultimately, again, the estate does not have to pay back the stolen object. So also remember again, we had this whole sugya. This halacha depends, right? What does it depend on? It depends if the item is extant, right? It depends if everyone knows that the item is a stolen item. Sometimes you may not be halachically required, right? The children may not be halachically required to return a stolen object, but alts covered avihim, right? Alts covered for their father, right? We don't want to maintain the stolen object. There's a lot of different pieces in this, but the point over here is that halacha is fascinating. when is there an obligation to return stolen property, or upon whom is there an obligation to return stolen property? Upon whom? The thief. So interestingly enough, when the thief dies, the mitzvah of the Heshavas HaGazela to return the stolen object does not devolve upon the children. Now again, I do want to point out, there are things that do devolve upon the children, like for example, debt. Right, debts of the father absolutely pass down to the children. But interestingly enough, the obligation to return stolen property does not devolve upon the children. So I'll say, so this is so interesting over here. So the Gemara wants to suggest that maybe the case over here, why does Shimon, the victim, right? Why does Shimon, the victim, go ahead and why does he have Yesh in this case? He has Yesh in this case because after Ruvain stole it and sold it to Levi, Ruvain died. So at this point in time, really, there's no real hope that ultimately, again, that Shimon is going to get paid back. So because there's Yesh Shinui Rishus, technically speaking, he can testify on behalf of Levi. Okay, I will look Mabi Yoresh. Why do we set this up as dealing with the case, ultimately, again, of the inheritor of the Ganav, of the thief, to which the Gemara says, Hani Chalamanda Amar, Rishus Yoresh, Lav Kirishus Lokeachtami. So that works well as long as you say that the domain, right, that the Rishus Yoresh, the domain of the inheritor, is that essentially an inheritor is not like a purchaser. But according to the opinion that says that an inheritor is just like a purchaser, so then it's the same case. It's the same case. Furthermore, again, there's another kasha according to Abaye. So again, so now remember, all of this is Abaye's interpretation of this case. There's another problem with the verbiage of the Brisa. The Brisa will say, if you go back for just a moment, you don't have to go back, I'll just read it to you again. If you go back on Mem Gimel Amud Beis, when we saw this Brisa, the way the Brisa phrased the distinction between the Reisha and the Seifa. Remember again, I'll say, the Reisha, so the two cases is if machalo bayis machalo sada ein meyad alav meisha achra yusu alav. Right? So again, literally translated, if you sell someone a home or you sell someone a field, you, the seller, can't testify on behalf of the purchaser because the achrayis is upon you. Now remember again, we really reinterpreted that case dramatically, right? We're going with Rav Shesh's reinterpretation that it's actually a case of Ruvain stole from Shimon. Where's the sale? The sale is Ruvain sold it to Levi, now being contested by Yehuda. Shimon, the original owner, can't testify on behalf of Levi, the purchaser. That's how we kind of reinterpreted this case. But just going with the simple reading of the case. So the ratio was, if I sold someone a home, I sold someone a field, I can't testify on their behalf because the achrayis is upon me. Seifa. If I sold someone a cow, I sold someone a talis, I can't testify on their behalf. Why? Because the achrayis is not on me. The Gemara says, one second, this has nothing to do with achrayis. Right? This has nothing to do with achrayis. Rather, what does it have to do with? The Gemara says, what does it have to do with? The Gemara says, look, that's not what it has to do. I will say, according to this entire interpretation, what is it that allows Shimon, the original owner, to testify on behalf of Levi or not? What does it depend on? See, here's the distinction. Let's work backwards, right? In the Metaltalin case, why is Shimon allowed to testify on behalf of Levi? Why? He's not getting the object back. He's not getting it back. So because he's not getting it back, the truth is, he doesn't, so to speak, have a horse in this race, right? I think it's the lights. He doesn't have any vested interest in this testimony, and therefore halacha l'maisa, he's going ahead and there's no reason not to take his edus. In case number one, I will say, remember again, what is Shimon trying to do? Right? What is Shimon trying to do? What's his goal? His goal is to get back his property. So he thinks it's just easier to get it back from Levi than it's going to be to get it back from Yehuda. That's the whole logic. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, he is not believed. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about achrayis? Nothing to do with achrayis, everything to do with whether or not you're going to get back your property. So the Gemara is just pointing out that according to Abaye's interpretation, at the end of the day, it is not, got so dark. All right. So, Don't we have like a committee to deal with these things, right? So therefore, again, the Gemara says that halacha l'maisa, the verbiage is wrong. So what do you do? Ella kidra barsho. So we'll say it's a new interpretation. So now, so just to be clear, right? Our first approach ultimately again was Rav Sheshes, and Rav Sheshes interpreted the cases again as Ruvain stealing from Shimon, selling to Levi, and now Yehuda coming along and claiming it from Levi. So is Shimon, the original owner, allowed to testify on Levi's behalf or not? It depends. If we're talking about real property, no. Movable property, yes. Okay, comes along Rabbi Shmuel and reinterprets it. Ella kidra bar Shmuel. Rabbi Bar Shmuel. Mishrei de Shmuel. Here we go. Habocher sadeh lechaver shelo ba'achrayis ein meid lo aleha mipnei shema'amida b'fnei balchov. Okay, so we actually saw this case before. We saw this, right? So Rabbi Bar Shmuel, what does Rabbi Bar Shmuel say? Because Rabbi Bar Shmuel says the name of Shmuel. If I sell a field to my friend without achrayis, okay, so now I'm just real estate transaction. I'm selling a field to Reuven without achrayis. Well, so what does it mean without achrayis? What does it mean without achrayis? That should the field be seized from Reuven for any reason, including because of me, I have other outstanding debt, and I'm selling Reuven a mortgaged piece of property. I can't pay back my debt, chas v'shalom. And then what happens? Someone now comes out to my property. Now again, I sold Reuven encumbered property. So halacha l'maisa now, my creditor comes and seizes it from Reuven. Reuven has no recourse against me. Again, as long as both of us agree to this, then that's fine. So I sold Reuven a field without achrayis. Then what's the halacha? Ein meid lo aleha. I cannot testify on Reuven. So now let's say someone else comes along and challenges Reuven's right to this land. So Reuven says, Silber, come to Beis Din and testify that you sold it to me. So what's the halacha? Although I'm happy to help out Reuven, I am not believed. Why am I not believed? I will say, because again, I'm nogea b'davar. Why am I nogea b'davar? Because as far as I'm concerned, it is good for me to go ahead and keep this in Reuven's possession. Why? Because l'maisa, should my creditors come after it, right? I know exactly where to direct them, right? I know exactly where they could find the property and who is the owner of their property. And again, I sold it to Reuven without achrayis, so it's understood that there's the possibility of loss. So therefore, because I have a vested interest in this testimony, I am not believed. B'davka b'ayis osada. Now this dafka only applies to real property. Aval para v'talis, but let's say I go ahead and I sell Reuven a cow or a cloak. Lo mi boy, Amud Beis will say, lo mi boy b'stoma to lo mishtab delay. So I will say now, it goes without saying that in general, when you sell movable property, I will say. So remember again, movable property is sold without encumbrances, without guarantees, I should say, right? Shalom ba'achrayis. So it goes without saying that if I'm selling Reuven a para or a talis, I'm selling him ultimately again a cow or a cloak, and I didn't make any guarantees about it. It's not lo mishtab delay. So the Gemara says. So in other words, whether I sold it to him, lo mi boy b'stama, lo mishtab delay. My timer, metaltalininu. Now we'll say, so again, if I'm selling, so let's just play that. Now remember, just this is a new interpretation of our brisa. So Rabbi Shmuel is coming along and saying like this. Unlike Rav Sheshes, who wanted to create a little bit more of a, not convoluted, but a little bit more of a complicated interpretation of the brisa's case, Rabbi Shmuel is coming along and let's talk about it straight. Here's the case, right? I'm selling property to Reuven, and I'm selling him property without achrayis, without responsibility. And now, Reuven's ownership of that property is being contested. Reuven asks me to come in and testify on his behalf. I'm happy to, but the halacha says I cannot. The halacha says I cannot, right? Why not? I'm an ogeh b'davar. Why am I an ogeh b'davar? Because again, it may be mortgaged for other debts that I have. Therefore, I can't. On the other hand, if I sell Reuven metaltalin, para or a talis, okay, you understand it's not limited to a cow or a talis. These are just the examples of metaltalin. I sell Reuven metaltalin. Now I will say, now the Gemara says, lo mi boy b'stama. Now again, lo mi boy b'stama means in general a sale. What we'll say, a sale of metaltalin is without achrayis. Right? In general, when you sell movable property is never sold with a guarantee. Right? It's not sold with a guarantee that if for some reason someone goes ahead and takes it from you because they claim that they have ownership over it, you deal with that, right? After I sell you this para or this talis, right? I'm done. If we don't see each other ever again, that's fine. In other words, you have no claim against me. Shlomi by bistama to lo mishtabdilei. Shabbos goes without saying that in general, when you sell metaltalin, that a stam sale of metaltalin is without achrayis. My taima metaltalin inhu. Why? It's such an interesting. We'll say a stam sale of metaltalin is without achrayis. Why? Because it's metaltalin. Almost like the Gemara is like what are you talking about? It's metaltalin. Of course, metaltalin comes without achrayis. Metaltalin lebalchov lemishabdi. So we'll say it's actually very interesting. Why is it in general that karka is sold with achrayis? Why is it that a general sale of real estate is sold with a guarantee? Why is that? So we'll say, let's work. It's very simple, because in general, when people borrow money, what do they secure their debts with? Right? Real estate. It is common for real estate to be mortgaged. So because of that, generally, real estate transactions come with a guarantee. On the other hand, people don't generally mortgage their metaltalin to their debts. So because at the Gemara said, "My time metaltalin inu umetaltalin lebalchov lo mishtabdi," and in general, people don't mortgage their metaltalin to their debts. The Gemara says, now, ba'afagav the kasav le miglimad al kasboi. Now I will say this is great. Now, what happens if a person writes, right? I borrow $1,000 from Shimon, and I say to Shimon, you could collect this debt afilu min galima da al kasboi, even from the shirt off my back. If that phrase sounds remotely familiar, that just means that you are paying a little bit of attention at your chasana, right? Because again, all of us hopefully heard this particular phrase. This is in the lashon of the ksuva. Again, we're going to discuss ksuva is actually different. Ksuva, the way it works is, remember again, a husband guarantees his wife's ksuva. What does he guarantee his wife's ksuva with? What does he guarantee it with? So the lashon of the ksuva is, what is your wife's ksuva guaranteed with? It's guaranteed with everything. Even with glima dal kasboi, even with the cloak on your back, the shirt off your back. Now, we'll put ksuva on the side for just a second. But the Gemara says, let's say even in a when you sell metaltalin to someone, let's say again I sell Ruvain a cow, and again in the document I write that the cow is guaranteed even from the cloak on my back. Hani mili disnu beinayu. Even if you want to say that metaltalin is guaranteed, metaltalin is only guaranteed if you have the metaltalin in your possession at the time that the claim is made against you. Avalesnu be'enayhu lo. But if you don't have the metaltalin, then of course again there's no such thing as a creditor clawing back metaltalin. So we'll say this is very important. The whole chap of shibur karkos, the whole chap of ultimately, again, a lien on land. What does a lien on land allow a creditor to do? A lien on land says like this: if I borrow $1,000 from Ruvain, now Ruvain has a lien against my property. I both say that lien never goes away. Meaning what? That even if I sell the land, right, and the land changes ownership multiple times, the lien never leaves. So therefore, again, if I can't pay back Ruvain chas v'shalom and I default on the loan, and Ruvain goes after the property, Ruvain can get that property from whoever he wants. Is there such a concept of a lien against metaltalin? Does that work? The answer is, it works, but it only works as long as the metaltalin are in the borrower's possession. This is incredibly important. So in other words, I borrow $1,000 from Ruvain. I say, Ruvain, you know what? Go ahead and here I'm mortgaging my 87-inch flat screen on which I only watch shiurim, of course, right? My 87-inch flat screen. Right, so I'm mortgaging that. That's fine, right? You could do that. And now Reuven has a claim in it as long as I own that flat screen. But should I sell that to someone else? Interestingly enough, the lien doesn't follow it. Big distinction between encumbered real property and movable property. Lien on real property follows that property wherever it goes. It could change ownership 100 times, the lien is still there. Lien on movable property, you could create it, but it's only meaningful so long as the borrower is in possession of that property. So now again, let's tie this back. So again, let's go back for just a second. Remember again, where are we? We're in Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel is saying in the name of his father. Rabbi Shmuel is interpreting the Brisa. He's interpreting it much simpler, right? I sell a field to Ruvain, and ultimately, again, Ruvain's ownership is challenged. Ruvain wants me to go, and this is without achrayas, without responsibility, right? So something happens to the field, Ruvain cannot come knocking on my door. I have no responsibility. Ruvain's ownership is challenged. He comes to me to testify on behalf of Beis Din. Brisa says, sorry, I am an inadmissible witness. Why? Nogeh b'davar, right? Again, I have a conflict of interest. Why? Because I want this property to remain with Ruvain, because it could very well be that this property is encumbered for my debts. And therefore, I have a vested, even though the lien follows it wherever, I have a vested interest in it remaining with Ruvain. On the other hand, if halacha l'maisa, I sell Ruvain a para or a talis, I sell him metaltalin. Now, we'll say then halacha l'maisa, I am, and now again, I sell to Ruvain, and now his ownership is contested. I am permitted to go ahead and testify on his behalf. Now, why is that? So the Gemara says, well, again, if I sold him the metaltalin without achrayas, then what? Then I should say, if I sold it to him stam sale of metaltalin is without achrayas, right? Why? Because Lamaisa, the only reason you generally have to sell with achrayas with a guarantee is because something may be encumbered. Generally, metaltalin is not encumbered. And even if metaltalin is encumbered, it's only encumbered so long as what? It's in the property of the borrower. So technically speaking, let's say the cow that I sold to Ruvain was encumbered. Let's say it was. Once I sell to Ruvain, what happens to the encumbrance? It's gone. As such, again, I am permitted to go ahead and testify on behalf of Ruvain, because again, I have no skin in this game. Like this cow is meaningless to me. The Gemara says, but not only that, ela afilu asa apotiki namilo. Right? So I will say this is actually very interesting. Let's say I made this cow an apotiki. Now what's an apotiki? Apotiki is a contraction for apotehei kai. So that is when you borrow money, you have the right. There's a concept of you could create. Let's say differently. I go ahead and I borrow $1,000 from Ruvain. So we'll say, so now whenever you borrow money, right? What's the problem with borrowing money? The problem with borrowing money is, well, there's a lot of problems with borrowing money, right? But Lamaisa, one of the problems is now my property becomes encumbered. When you have encumbered property, it's much more difficult to go ahead and transact business, right? People are going to do a title search. They're going to see the liens on my property. It's much more difficult to do anything. So Lamaisa, how do you get around that? So there's an interesting mechanism called an apotiki. An apotiki says, I borrow $1,000 and I say, Ruvain, listen, instead of having a general lien against all of my property, I'd like to designate a particular item for you to be the source of repayment. What that does is it places the lien on one item and doesn't allow the lien to devolve upon all the other stuff. Now again, obviously Ruvain has to agree to that, but if he does, it's good for Ruvain because Ruvain has a defined source of repayment in the event that I can't pay him back, and it's good for me because it lifts the lien from all of my other properties so I could transact business with other things. That's called an apotiki. So let's say for argument's sake, I went ahead and designated this cow as an apotiki, right? So I'm selling Ruvain a cow, but meanwhile, again, I borrowed $1,000 from Shimon, and this cow was the apotiki. So the Gemara says, "Ala afilu asa apotiki namilo." So the truth is, I will say, the truth is, even if I made the cow an apotiki and I default on payment, right? Shimon still can't collect that cow. My time, and so I will say, this is actually very interesting. Even if you designate a piece of metaltalin as an apotiki, that lien apparently only remains on that object so long as what? As the object is in my possession. Once I sell that object, even an apotiki lien is released, which is incredible. My time, so we'll say, by the way, just before we go on to the reasoning, so you would see based on this, by the way, that if you are going to accept an apotiki, really the only thing you should accept an apotiki on is what? Is land, right? So in other words, and you could do that, and there's a way, in other words, so now, if I borrow $1,000 from Shimon, and I can say, Shimon, listen, could we do this? Could we agree that the lien only devolves upon field A? And again, if we both agree on that, that works great. That works great. Then at least so I do have one encumbered piece of property, but so all of my other pieces of property are now unencumbered and I can do as I please. So now let's go back to Abokis. This is incredible. But let's say again, I borrowed $1,000 from Shimon. I borrowed $1,000 from Shimon, and now we agreed that my prize cow is going to be the apotiki. This is my prize cow. This is not like a regular cow. This is my prize cow. It's the apotiki. So now again, there's a defined lien on it. The Gemara says, even so, once I sell that prize cow, everything has a price. Everything has a price, even the prize cow, right? Once I sell the prize cow, then halacha l'maisa, the apotiki lien is removed. Kid Rava. Why? What does Rava say? The Amar Rava asa abda apotiki umach. So if I made my eved an apotiki umachro, and I sold it, bal chov gova mimenu. So if I made my servant an apotiki, and I sold the eved kinani, and I sold the eved, so now again I will say the creditor has the ability to still to collect from that eved, right? So, however, shorov, and I will say now, what's the logic behind that? An eved is huksha lekarkos, right? An eved is treated like karka. So because of that, again, a lien on an eved is no different than a lien on karka. So just like if karka is an apotiki, the lien remains even if it's sold. So too, if you sell an eved, the lien remains even if you sell it. However, shora v'chamora apotiki. Let's say I made my shor or my chamor an apotiki umachro, and then I sold it. Ein bal chov gova hemenu. In that case, interestingly enough, the bal chov cannot collect from it. My time, what's the reason? Hi is leikala, baha less leikala. Shabbos said it's very interesting. What's the reason for that? The Gemara suggests because the sale of an eved has a kol, people know about it. The sale of metaltalin doesn't have a kol, people don't know about it. Take a look at Rashi. Drashbam is leikala. Rashi says va'afsidu lekuchos anafshayu. Hales leikala para vitalis velo yadu halekuchos leizar vehilchach meyed lo ala de'in mamid b'fnei bal chovos. So okay. So the idea over here is when people sell an eved, right? Sale of an eved is a more significant sale, and therefore you do a title search. You do a title search. So when you do a title search, what is Reuven going to discover when he does his title search on my eved? He's going to discover that it's an apotiki to my loan to Shimon. Okay, and therefore now again he could choose to go forward with it or not, right? But Lamais again, that's his business, right? Conversely, when I sell a cow or I sell a talis, that's metaltalin. But sale of metaltalin doesn't really generate that much public attention, and therefore it's much more difficult to do a title search on metaltalin, or virtually impossible to do a title search on metaltalin. And therefore, again, the buyer has no way of knowing that ultimately, again, this is encumbered para or talis. Therefore, I will say, interestingly enough, so therefore, halacha l'maisa, what the Gemara is suggesting is as follows. So first of all, just a number of fascinating halachas that are happening over here. So number one, again, so there is never, the only time, okay, you could create a lien against metaltalin, but the lien against metaltalin only applies so long as what? So long as the borrower has a metaltalin in his possession. This is true even if you make the metaltalin an apotiki, which is a higher level of lienkite, right? So you can even if you make a mamish an apotiki, even apotiki status only remains when the object is in the possession of the borrower. But once the borrower sells it, even an apotiki lien is lifted. And again, the logic is because sale of metaltalin does not garner any attention. Because of that, there's no way for the buyer to know that this is encumbered. Therefore, it's unfair to the buyer. Therefore, we lift the lien. So we'll say, just to come full circle, just remember again, why are we doing all this? Remember, we're focusing on the brisa. What's the second case of the brisa? I sold Reuven a para or I sold Reuven a para or a talis. Now Reuven's ownership is contested. Now Reuven wants me to testify on his behalf in the Beis Din. Am I allowed to do so? The brisa says, yes, I am. Why am I allowed to do so? I have no negios. Because the truth is, I don't have a horse in this race. Like it doesn't matter. Like in other words, I don't benefit if Reuven has this or doesn't have this. It doesn't impact me. Why? What about the fact that maybe the par or the talis are encumbered? There's no encumbrances by metaltalin. Maybe it's an apotiki. Even if it wasn't apotiki, once it left my domain, then what? The apotiki lien it dissolved. Therefore, because I have no negios, therefore I am allowed to go ahead and testify. Maybe we're talking about a case over here where I conveyed I conveyed this metaltalin through karka, agav mekarkoi, in which case, right, the Gemara says, Da'amar Rabba, I akni le metaltali agav mekarkoi kani. So I'll say, so ultimately again, that if metaltalin is transferred with karka, agav karka, that ultimately again, the lien remains upon the metaltalin. Okay, so this is very interesting. So apparently there is one way for a lien against metaltalin to remain even if the metaltalin are sold, and that's if the metaltalin were sold agav karka. If the metaltalin essentially were sold as part of a real estate transaction, right? Remember again, we've seen you could sell movable property with, you could sell movable property with karka, with unmovable property, either again by literally having the movable property situated on top of the karka, or even not situated on top of the karka, just through acquiring the real property, you acquire the movable property as well. So another interesting fact about this apparently is, if you acquire movable property, agov, real property, agov karka, that allows the liens on the movable property to remain. So apparently there is a way. Let's say you designated metaltalin as an apoteki for your debt. So normally if you would sell the metaltalin, the apoteki lien would dissolve. But apparently if you sell the metaltalin agav karka as part of a real estate transaction, the apoteki lien remains. Who knew? Who knew? Fascinating, right? Fascinating. So maybe we should be concerned about this. And if that's the case, then I shouldn't be allowed to testify on behalf of Ruvain when his ownership of the para or the talis is contested, because maybe the apoteki liens of these items still exist, in which case I'm an ogea b'davar in the eidos, and I shouldn't be believed. To which the Gemara says, I akne metaltli agav karka kani mekarka kani metaltli. V'amrav Chisda v'hu dekasav la delo kasmachta u delo kitov say dishtari. Now also if Chisda just comes along and says, by the way, that is provided ultimately again that you included in that document of sale, that there should not be like an asmachta and should not be like tov say dishtari, boilerplate stars. In other words, you have to indicate in the document of sale that you mean to really convey the metaltalin agav the karka, so that this is a real transaction, in which case the loans remain. Hacham asking. So we'll say, so again, we're just asking, you make it sound so simple that I could testify on Ruvain's behalf in the case of para or talis, because there's no way that I could have any benefit from this, because any liens that I may have had against that metaltalin dissolve upon the sale of them to Ruvain, but that's not true. There is a way to preserve those liens. So maybe we should be concerned that I'm an ogeh b'davar, therefore I can't testify. No, hacham askinon kigon shalakach umachar li alter. Okay, I will say, what's the case? The case is where, what's my business? Flipping cows. Not to be confused with tipping cows, right? Two different malachas, right? So what do? In other words, I buy livestock and I flip it. And I sell it quickly, right? Or I buy clothing and I flip it. I sell it quickly. So the idea over here, so we'll say, so what's the chap of this? What's the chap? The chap the Gemara says is, I bought and sold the item so quickly that there's no way it got encumbered. In other words, there's no fear of encumbrance just because of the speed of the multiple transactions. In other words, this is my malacha. I flip livestock. So what do? I buy it, resell it quickly. So because that, the Gemara says that's the case, and therefore again, in this case, let's plug it in. So I go ahead, I sold the cow to Ruvain. So now again, Reuben's ownership is being contested. The Brisa says, Reuben says, please come to Beis Din and testify on my behalf. I am allowed to. Why? Because there's no possibility that I benefit from this eidos. What about all of the different possibilities that maybe it's still encumbered? No. The case is where I bought the cow and sold it quickly, and everything happened so quickly, there's no way that this became encumbered to any debt that I may have taken. The Gemara says, 1 second. Oh, okay. So we'll say, so now this is very interesting. So perhaps we should be choshesh for something else. Take a look at what's the first wide line in the Rashbam. V'nechash dilma deikne amarlei. Kilomar akati kilomechash deakni leilahach para vitalis lemalva agav mikarkoi vehechi dami kigon demakni hachi kishalava kasav lemalva b'shtar mishabda lecha agav mikarkoi kol nechasi dikanoi udaasid ana lemikne. Wow. Get ready for this. Maybe I did the following. Maybe I borrowed money from Shimon. I borrowed $1,000 from Shimon. And here's what I wrote in the shtar to Shimon. I said, Shimon, here's the deal. Right? I am borrowing money from you, and I hereby put a lien against my property and against anything I will acquire. I will acquire. The ikni, right? Anything I will acquire ultimately becomes covered. We'll say, so this is mind-blowing, right? Because up until now, whenever we've spoken about liens and encumbrances, it only devolves upon what? Upon what? What you own at this moment. It never devolves upon what you will own. Now, by the way, if this sounds a little bit familiar, once again, you were paying attention for a couple of minutes at Shechasana, because we're going to see again that ksuva, this wording is all found in the ksuva. It's all found in the Ksuva. Again, we'll come back to it in just a little bit. Well, by a little bit, I mean tomorrow. Right? So the Maisa again. So maybe the Gemara says, why do I have to be choshesh? Okay, you're saying that I flip cows. So fine. So I buy a cow, I quickly sell it. There's no way I got to cover it. But maybe when I borrowed money from Shimon, the way we structure the debt is anything I do own or will own becomes encumbered. In which case, there is an encumbrance against this, right? And maybe again, I even made an apotiki. So in other words, maybe there is an encumbrance. In other words, you make it sound like because I flip it, there is no way that there could be an encumbrance, but there could be if I do a future lien. The Gemara says, Shamas Mina, what do you see from here? The ikni, that I will say, if I use this lashon of ikni, that anything I will acquire becomes encumbered. If that's the case, kana, umachar kana vahorish lo mishtabed. So I will say the fact that we're not worried about this indicates to us that what? That ikni doesn't work. Doesn't work. Right? That lamaisa, some type of future lien doesn't devolve upon property. So in other words, that if I make this lashon of the ikni and then I buy something and then I sell it, or I acquire it and I bequeath it to my children, lo mishtabed. There is no lien against that property. To which the Gemara says, no. Lo tzricha da amri edim yadinan bei bahai to lo havi le ara me'olam. So we'll say, so also it's quite possible that we're talking about a situation where the edim said over here that halacha l'maisa, this person never had any property at all. Right? Where witnesses testify about me that I never had any property at all. Take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. Lo tzricha. It's in the widest lines, about 6 lines in. Lo tzricha. Hada amrinan meyed v'lo chashina ledilma akni le metaltli aga mekarkoi. We're just circling back because we'll say one of the questions the Gemara asked was, remember, there is one way, right? Now we're learning a lot about metaltlin over here. So the Gemara says over here. So first of all, the ikni case we're not worried about. It seems to be the one thing that we're worried about. The one thing we're worried about is a situation where, let's say again, I went ahead and sold metaltalin agav karka, right? Because if I sold metaltalin agav karka, then what does that have the ability to do? That makes the whole thing like a karka transaction. Because the whole thing is like a karka transaction, then what? Then any pre-existing liens against metaltalin remain on the metaltalin. Right, remain on the metaltalin. If that's the case, how can I testify on behalf of Ruvain? To which the Gemara says, no, that's not a problem, because there are eidim that say that I never owned land ever. I never owned land. So they testify about me. So because I never owned land, therefore there's no way that I ever transferred metaltalin agav karka. Okay. So I'll say, so now listen to this. Papa said as follows. What about the fact that our Papa said as follows? The rabbi said, right? If I sell land to my friend without achrayas, right? So ultimately, again, without a guarantee, and Balchov comes along and seizes that land, so ultimately, again, then halacha l'maisa, right? So we'll say straightforward case. If I sell land without achrayas, I sell Ruvain land without achrayas, and then my creditor comes and seizes the land from Ruvain has no recourse against me. Nimtzeis she'eno shalo chozra alav. So we'll say, we'll have to stop over here for a time. I'm leaving you a little bit on a cliffhanger. But again, well, actually, yeah. Okay, so I know I can't. I'm not going to rush through it. So I'll say what we will see something very interesting. I'm going to pause with this case over, then we'll close it out tomorrow and start with the gufa again. But I will say, but here's what I want to point out. Normally, when you sell shaloba achrayas, right, without a guarantee, so what does that do? That prevents the purchaser from coming back against me. Let's say I sell property that never belonged to me altogether. So that's a fraudulent sale. There's a difference between property that's seized by a creditor, encumbered property, versus a fraudulent sale. In that case, the buyer does have recourse. Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm just dangling that in front of you now. We'll come back to both sides. So we have not yet fully explained the Brisa. What we do know is that we have two dramatically different interpretations. Rav Sheshes and Ravin Bar Shmuel, we have accumulated a ridiculous and incredible amount of information, such a short daf, but along the way of this journey, how we plug it in and resolution. And Mirat Hashem tomorrow, Shkoyach. All right, Chavron Zoom, have a great day, everyone.